It requires a terrifying level of confidence to look at investigators and say 4 simple words: "I am being framed." But in the case of the disappearance at Praia da Luz, this statement created a logical nightmare that has baffled criminologists for nearly 2 decades. We are not just talking about a missing person today. We are talking about a forensic impossibility. How can biological traces of a victim be found in a rental car that the family did not hire until 25 days after the disappearance was reported? The detection dogs alerted to a specific forensic scent. The DNA analysis revealed 15 out of 19 markers, and the timeline suggests a crime that defies the laws of physics. Today, we are stripping away the media noise to analyze the silent evidence, the linguistic slip-ups, and the psychological warfare between a family and the police. If you are ready to examine the facts that the headlines ignored, please go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel right now. Let's unravel the mystery of the evidence that shouldn't exist. In the spring of the year 2007, the coastal town of Praia da Luz in Portugal became the epicenter of one of the most perplexing investigations in modern history. To understand the gravity of the events that unfolded on the evening of May 3rd, it is necessary to first analyze the environment. This was not a desolate location. It was a bustling holiday resort designed for families, offering a sense of community and safety that, according to security analysts, often leads to a lowered state of vigilance among tourists. This psychological phenomenon, often termed the resort bubble, suggests that visitors frequently believe the security provided by the establishment extends further than it actually does. The apartment in question, located on the ground floor of the Ocean Club complex, sat at the intersection of a public street and the resort grounds. From an investigative standpoint, this location is critical. It offered accessibility to the parents dining nearby, but it also offered accessibility to any external observer. Security experts reviewing the layout have noted that the ground floor position, combined with a public thoroughfare, presented a significant vulnerability that would later become a focal point of the inquiry. The apartment was not a fortress. It was a temporary residence with sliding patio doors that, according to various statements, were left unlocked to allow the parents to enter without a key during their checks. The narrative of that specific evening centers on a group of friends, later dubbed by the media as the Tapper Seven, who were dining at the Tapas restaurant within the resort complex. The group, consisting of the parents of the missing daughter and their friends, had established a system of rotating checks. They did not use a professional sitting service that evening. Instead, they opted to physically walk from the restaurant to the apartments at regular intervals to monitor the sleeping individuals. From a procedural perspective, this method of listening checks, or brief visual inspections, is highly controversial. It relies on the assumption that a brief look is sufficient to ensure safety. However, criminologists point out that this system leaves windows of time, typically 20 to 30 minutes, where the apartment is entirely unmonitored. It was within one of these windows of opportunity that the narrative shifted from a routine holiday evening to a complex criminal case. According to the established timeline, the father checked the apartment at roughly 5 minutes past 9. He reported seeing the daughter sleeping soundly. The door was slightly ajar. This detail is significant because, upon the next check, the state of the door had allegedly changed. At approximately 9:30, a member of the group offered to check the apartment, but only listened at the door, entering no further. This action, while well-intentioned, added a layer of uncertainty to the timeline. Without a visual confirmation at 9:30, the last verified sighting of the daughter remained the check performed at 9:05. The turning point occurred at 10 o'clock at night. The mother left the dining table to conduct her check. Upon entering the apartment, she discovered that the window in the bedroom was open and the shutters were raised. Most importantly, the bed where her daughter had been sleeping was empty. The immediate reaction was one of confusion, followed by rapidly escalating panic. The mother returned to the restaurant, not with a quiet concern, but in a state of high distress. Witnesses reported her shouting that she has been taken. This specific choice of words is crucial for statement analysts. By immediately attributing the disappearance to an external act of removal rather than exploring the possibility that the daughter had simply wandered off, the mother set the initial trajectory of the investigation toward abduction. Analysts like Tanya Cadogan, who later reviewed the case files, often look at these initial utterances to understand the speaker's mindset. Was it an intuitive leap, or was it based on immediate visual evidence, such as the open window? Following the declaration that the daughter was missing, the preservation of the location, which was now technically a crime scene, failed significantly. In a standard police procedure, the area would be sealed off immediately to preserve forensic evidence, such as fingerprints, fibers, and DNA. However, in the chaos of May 3rd, this protocol was not enacted. Reports indicate that numerous people, including the friends from the dinner group, resort staff, and eventually local police officers, entered and exited the apartment. They searched under beds, opened cupboards, and moved through the rooms. From a forensic standpoint, this activity is catastrophic. It introduces transfer evidence hair, fibers, and biological material from people unconnected to the crime, while potentially destroying vital traces left by a perpetrator. Observers have noted that this initial contamination made the later work of forensic teams incredibly difficult. When biological samples were eventually recovered, the defense could arguably claim that the presence of foreign DNA was due to this chaotic search rather than criminal activity. The golden hour, a term used by investigators to describe the vital period immediately following a crime where evidence is fresh, was effectively lost in a wave of well-meaning but destructive panic. As news of the disappearance spread through the resort and eventually to the global media, two distinct narratives began to form. The first was the story of a predator stalking the resort, seizing a moment of opportunity during the parents' dinner. This narrative was supported by the open window and the mother's immediate assertion of abduction. It painted the parents as victims of a terrible crime, suffering the loss of their daughter due to a security breach. However, a second, more analytical perspective began to emerge among law enforcement professionals. They questioned the logistics of an abduction. They looked at the timeline, the narrow windows between checks, and the lack of noise. The silence of the night was perplexing. If an intruder had entered and exited with a sleeping individual, how was it accomplished without alerting the siblings sleeping in the same room or the parents dining less than 100 yards away? This skepticism laid the groundwork for the friction that would later develop between the family and the investigators. The parents, both medical professionals, were accustomed to operating in a world of logic and procedure. Yet, their decision to leave the daughter unattended, even with checks, faced intense public scrutiny. The media, initially sympathetic, began to ask difficult questions about parental responsibility. It is important to introduce the psychological concept of defensive framing here, as it becomes relevant in later chapters. As the hours turned into days without a ransom demand or a discovery, the pressure on the parents intensified. Later in the investigation, the mother would claim she was being framed. This statement, though made later, is rooted in the events of this first night. Analysts suggest that the seeds of the framing theory, the idea that evidence was planted to implicate the parents, stem from the sheer impossibility of the situation in their minds. If they knew they were innocent, and yet the police were finding inconsistencies, their logical conclusion had to be external manipulation. However, statement analysts argue that claiming to be framed is a unique linguistic choice. It acknowledges the existence of incriminating evidence while denying responsibility for it. This complex psychological dynamic began the moment the alarm was raised, creating a divide between the family's internal reality and the external investigation. In the hours following the disappearance, witness statements were collected. These initial accounts are often considered the most reliable, as they are least affected by media narratives and memory decay. However, inconsistencies appeared almost immediately. Descriptions of potential suspects seen carrying a sleeping individual varied. Timelines offered by the dining group had slight discrepancies regarding who checked at what time and how thoroughly. These small variances are common in traumatic situations, but in a high-profile case, they become magnified. Investigators scrutinized every minute of the timeline. The Tapper 7 presented a united front, but this very unity sparked suspicion among cynical observers who questioned whether the timeline was too perfectly constructed to be natural. Was the group's coordination a sign of organized responsibility, or simply the result of friends trying to help reconstruct a confusing night? By the time the sun rose over Praia da Luz on the morning of May 4th, the world had changed for the family. The local police, the GNR, had been replaced by the PJ, the Policia Judiciaria, who handles serious crimes. The resort was no longer a holiday destination, but a focal point of global interest. The daughter was gone, vanishing into the mist of conflicting testimonies and contaminated scenes. The failure to secure the apartment, the reliance on a timeline provided by the suspects in the eyes of the police, and the immediate media firestorm created a perfect storm for a cold case. The physical evidence, what little remained after the chaotic search, would not be fully analyzed for months. When it was, specifically the samples found in the apartment and later in a vehicle, it would turn the investigation on its head. But on that first night, there was only absence, panic, and the beginning of a mystery that would divide public opinion for decades. The silence of the apartment stood in stark contrast to the noise that was about to engulf the lives of everyone involved. The following 48 hours after the initial alarm was raised represented a critical juncture where the chaotic energy of a local search collided with the rigid structures of a criminal investigation. As the sun rose over the Algarve, the small resort town transformed from a leisure destination into a theater of international scrutiny. The transition was not seamless. It was marked by a clash of cultures, procedures, and expectations that would define the case for years to come. In those early hours, the preservation of the scene, a fundamental tenet of modern forensics, had already been compromised by the desperate, well-intentioned search efforts of staff and guests who had trampled through the apartment and the surrounding gardens. The arrival of the local authorities, the GNR, followed by the specialized judicial police, signaled a shift in tone. However, analysts reviewing the procedural steps taken during this period often point to a significant delay in sealing the borders and monitoring the roadways. In a typical abduction scenario, the immediate containment of the geographical area is paramount. Critics of the initial response argue that the golden hour, that vital window of time where evidence is fresh and the perpetrator is likely still within range, was squandered due to a lack of immediate coordination. The assumption that the missing individual had simply wandered off delayed the implementation of a full-scale criminal blockade, a decision that would haunt the investigation as the timeline extended from hours into days. Simultaneously, a distinct strategy was emerging from the family and their surrounding group. Rather than relying solely on the local police protocols, there was an almost immediate mobilization of the media. This approach was unprecedented in its speed and scale. Within hours, photographs were being circulated, and the narrative of abduction was being firmly established in the public consciousness. From a strategic perspective, this use of the press was a double-edged sword. On one hand, it generated global awareness, ensuring that the face of the missing subject was known in every corner of the continent. On the other hand, it placed the investigators under a microscope, creating a pressure cooker environment where every procedural delay was amplified and criticized by a 24-hour news cycle. This media campaign also served to solidify the abduction theory before any physical evidence could confirm it. Statement analysts and psychologists have since scrutinized this early behavior, noting the consistency with which the parents maintained this narrative. The source material indicates that both parents, being medical professionals, faced potential professional and social ruin if any negligence or internal family failure were exposed. This fear of professional consequences, the loss of medical licenses or employmentas, been cited by analysts as a potent psychological driver that could influence early statements and the rigid adherence to the abduction story. The theory suggests that the immediate and absolute focus on an external perpetrator was not just a reaction to the event, but a necessary shield against the destruction of their reputation and family unit. As the hours turned into the second day, the friction between the family and the Portuguese authorities became palpable. The Portuguese legal system operates under the secrecy of justice, a principle that forbids the disclosure of details during an ongoing investigation. This stood in direct contrast to the British media's demand for constant updates and the family's campaign for transparency. The relationship between the two sides began to deteriorate, shifting from mutual cooperation to a state of distrust. The police prioritized forensic procedure and quiet inquiry, while the family viewed this silence as incompetence or apathy. This divergence created an atmosphere of opposition, where the investigators felt besieged by the media and the family felt abandoned by the system. During these critical first days, the behavior of the group dining with the parents, often referred to in reports, also came under scrutiny. There was a notable discipline in their interactions with the press and the police, leading some observers to describe it as a pact of silence or a unified front designed to protect the group's collective liability. The lack of fractures in their story was interpreted by supporters as the truthfulness of innocent witnesses, while skeptics viewed it as a form of psychological containment and effort to keep a consistent story in the face of immense pressure. The analysis of their language revealed a heavy use of collective pronouns like we and us, which linguists suggest is a way to distribute emotional responsibility and maintain a unified defense. By the end of the first 48 hours, the physical search of the immediate vicinity had yielded nothing: no clothing, no tracks, and no witnesses to a crime in progress. This absence of physical evidence deepened the mystery. If an abduction had occurred, it had been executed with an improbable level of stealth in a populated area. Conversely, if the answer lay within the apartment, the contamination of the scene made proving it a forensic nightmare. The investigation was already stalling, caught between the lack of clues and the overwhelming noise of the media circus. It became clear that conventional search methods were failing, and a different, more scientific approach would be required. This realization set the stage for the introduction of specialized forensic teams and the controversial use of detection dogs, marking the beginning of the shift from a missing person case to a potential homicide inquiry. The narrative was about to turn from looking for a lost individual to looking for microscopic traces of a crime that no one wanted to believe had happened. As the weeks turned into a month without a single confirmed sighting or a credible ransom demand, the investigation reached a critical stagnation point. The conventional methods of search and rescue, combing the landscape, interviewing witnesses, and monitoring border crossing had yielded no physical trace of the missing daughter. Faced with a vacuum of evidence and mounting pressure from both the international media and political spheres, the investigative team recognized the need to pivot from a standard missing person inquiry to a more forensic-based approach. This necessity led to the introduction of specialized resources that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of the case. The deployment of 2 highly trained detection dogs from the United Kingdom. The decision to bring in these specialized units was not merely a procedural step. It was a tacit admission that the investigation was shifting its focus toward a darker hypothesis. The 2 dogs, handled by Martin Grime, possessed distinct skill sets that were crucial for this new phase of the inquiry. Unlike standard police dogs used for tracking live scents or subduing suspects, these animals were conditioned to detect the invisible aftermath of violent events. One dog was trained specifically to identify biological traces, while the other was trained to detect specific forensic markers associated with a critical event. This distinction was paramount, as it allowed investigators to differentiate between a survivable injury and a fatal occurrence. From an analytical perspective, the arrival of this team introduced a complex layer of forensic debate. Legal experts and criminologists have long argued over the reliability of canine alerts as admissible evidence. The consensus within the scientific community is that while a dog can detect the presence of a substance with remarkable sensitivity, the alert itself serves primarily as an intelligence tool rather than definitive proof of guilt. Analysts reviewing the case emphasize that the specific chemical compounds detected can originate from various biological sources and cannot be tied by scent alone to a specific individual. Therefore, the dog's reaction is not the end of the investigative process, but the beginning of a forensic chain of custody. Any material traces that trigger an alert require rigorous laboratory testing to determine whether they can be scientifically linked to the missing subject. The introduction of these dogs also highlighted a significant cultural and procedural divide between the investigating nations. In the United Kingdom, the use of such dogs is a standard component of major crime inquiries, and their alerts often provide the probable cause necessary to obtain warrants or justify further searches. However, the weight given to this type of intelligence varies significantly across different legal systems. In this specific case, the reliance on the dogs became a point of contention. Skeptics argued that without corroborating physical evidence as a body or a weapon, the alerts were open to interpretation and could be the result of cross-contamination or the transfer of scents from previous occupants or innocent sources. This phase of the investigation was characterized by a palpable tension between the desire for answers and the limitations of forensic science. The dogs were tasked with examining not just the holiday apartment, but also the surrounding areas and items associated with the family. The specific focus was on determining if the missing daughter had been present in locations that did not fit the abduction timeline. The analysts noted that later forensic testing identified 19 genetic markers in one of the recovered samples. Of those 19 markers, 15 were found to be consistent with the known DNA profile of the missing daughter. This partial match created a statistical and legal quagmire. While a match of that strength might be viewed as significant in British policing, the Portuguese authorities operated under a standard that typically required a full 15 out of 15 match for a conclusive identification. The reliance on the detection dogs also raised questions about the timing of the evidence. Critics and analysts alike pointed out the logistical challenges presented by the timeline. The alerts occurred in both the apartment and a vehicle that the family did not hire until 25 days after the disappearance. This temporal discrepancy fueled intense speculation. If the dogs were detecting a scent related to the missing daughter in a vehicle obtained weeks later, it implied a continuity of contact that contradicted the abduction narrative. However, without a verified chain of custody explaining how those traces were deposited, the evidence remained technically inconclusive. Furthermore, the psychological impact of this specialized search on the parents cannot be overstated. They were witnessing a shift from a search for their living daughter to a search for biological remnants. This transition likely intensified the defensive posture that analysts later observed in their statements. When the mother later claimed she was being framed, it was in direct response to the implications raised by these specific forensic findings. The analyst Tanya K. Dogan noted that by using the word framed, the mother was implicitly acknowledging that evidence existed which proved the daughter was no longer alive and that this evidence had been placed to link her to that death. This interpretation suggests that the parents were acutely aware of the dangerous narrative being constructed around the dog alerts and the subsequent DNA analysis. Ultimately, the deployment of the specialized dogs served to deepen the mystery rather than solve it. Instead of providing a clear path to the perpetrator, the alerts created a fragmented picture that was open to multiple interpretations. Some viewed the alerts as proof of a cover-up, while others saw them as the result of a flawed investigation desperate for leads. The only certainty was that the physical evidence, rather than clarifying the events of that night, had added a layer of complexity that continues to divide opinion. The dogs had done their job by identifying areas of interest, but the inability of science to provide a definitive 100% match left the case in a state of perpetual ambiguity. The investigation had moved beyond the search for a missing person and had entered the murky waters of forensic probability, where truth is often obscured by the limitations of technology and the conflicting interpretations of the law. The investigation reached a pivotal juncture when the inquiry turned inward, focusing intently on the holiday apartment that had been the last known location of the missing daughter. Following the arrival of the specialized canine units from the United Kingdom, The search protocols shifted from a broad sweep of the landscape to a microscopic examination of the interior environment. The two detection dogs, handled by Martin Ney, were introduced to the residents to determine if there were any biological indicators that human eyes had missed. This phase of the operation was critical because it moved beyond witness testimony and into the realm of forensic science, seeking to answer whether the apartment was merely the site of a disappearance or the scene of a more permanent tragedy. When the dogs were deployed within the apartment, their reactions were immediate and specific. Reports indicate that the animals alerted to distinct areas within the living space, most notably behind the sofa and near the wardrobe. These alerts were treated as highly significant by the investigative team because the dogs were trained to distinguish between the scent of residual traces from a minor injury and the specific scent associated with a more serious forensic anomaly. The reaction of the animals suggested to the authorities that significant biological material had, at some point, been present in those specific locations. However, analysts reviewing the case have consistently emphasized a crucial distinction in forensic logic. While the detected scent can originate from various biological sources, it cannot be identified by scent alone as belonging to a specific individual. The alert provided the intelligence, but the physical samples provided the evidence. Following the dog's indication, forensic teams concentrated their efforts on the areas behind the sofa, recovering microscopic fluid samples for laboratory analysis. This material was different from a mere scent. It was physical biological matter that could be subjected to DNA profiling. The samples were sent for advanced testing to determine their origin. The results of this analysis became the subject of an intense international debate regarding statistical probability and the burden of proof. The forensic testing identified 19 genetic markers within the recovered sample. Of those 19 markers, 15 were found to be consistent with the known DNA profile of the missing daughter. The remaining 4 markers were deemed too damaged to yield a reliable result. This statistical finding exposed a deep fracture between the legal standards of the two nations involved. In the United Kingdom, a match of 15 out of 19 markers is generally considered extremely strong evidence, often sufficient to meet the threshold for probable cause and to warrant charges in a criminal court. However, the Portuguese legal system operated under a different set of evidentiary rules, which typically required a full 15 out of 15 match for a conclusive identification. Under that strict standard, the evidence found behind the sofa remained technically inconclusive. Nevertheless, analysts pointed out that while the result did not meet the Portuguese threshold for a definitive match, the pattern did not exclude the missing daughter as the donor of the material. The implications of these findings were profound. If the biological fluid behind the sofa did indeed belong to the missing daughter, it forced investigators to confront difficult questions about the timeline and the nature of the event. Statement analyst Tanya Cadogan noted that the existence of these fluids was central to the mother's later claim that she was being framed. Cadogan argued that by using the term framed, the mother was implicitly acknowledging that the evidence found in the apartment belonged to her daughter, and that her daughter was in a condition that allowed such samples to be deposited. The analyst's interpretation suggests that the defense was not arguing that the evidence was fake, but rather disputing how it arrived at that location. This dispute opened the door to the theory of contamination and transfer. Skeptics of the forensic findings argued that, in a rental property, DNA from previous occupants or transfer from clothing and toys could confuse the results. However, the specificity of the dog's alerts to the scent of decomposition challenged the idea of simple, casual contact or minor injury. The presence of the fluids raised the possibility that the apartment was not just where the family slept, but where a fatal event may have occurred. This shifted the entire scope of the investigation. The narrative of an intruder entering and leaving without a trace struggled to coexist with the forensic indication that significant biological markers were present inside the secure perimeter of the living room. As the news of the DNA results filtered through to the public and the press, the atmosphere surrounding the family changed. They were no longer viewed solely as victims of a terrible external crime. They were now subjects of forensic scrutiny. The ambiguity of the 15 out of 19 match allowed two parallel realities to exist. To the Portuguese police, the evidence suggested a domestic tragedy and a subsequent cover-up. To the family and their supporters, the inconclusive nature of the result, combined with the lack of a full match, was proof that the investigation was flawed and grasping at straws. This forensic stalemate left the case in a state of limbo, where science could suggest a truth but could not legally prove it, leaving the interpretation of the alerts behind the sofa to be decided by the court of public opinion rather than a court of law. The investigation entered a phase of intense scientific scrutiny as the biological samples recovered from the holiday apartment were packaged and expedited for advanced laboratory analysis. This marked the transition from physical searching to forensic decoding, a process where the silent testimony of microscopic evidence would be challenged by legal standards and statistical probability. The material in question, collected from the areas where the specialized detection dogs had alerted, was subjected to rigorous testing to determine its genetic origin. This was no longer about eyewitness accounts or timeline discrepancies. It was about the fundamental question of identity and presence. The objective was to determine if the biological fluids found behind the sofa and in the rented vehicle could be scientifically linked to the missing daughter, thereby proving her presence in locations and at times that contradicted the established narrative of abduction. When the results of the forensic testing were returned, they did not provide the simple binary answer of positive or negative that the public might have expected. Instead, they presented a complex statistical picture that would become the subject of fierce debate between the investigating nations. The analysis identified 19 specific genetic markers within the recovered sample. Of those 19 markers, the laboratory determined that 15 were consistent with the known DNA profile of the missing daughter. The remaining 4 markers were described as being too damaged or degraded to yield a reliable reading, leaving the profile technically incomplete. This result, known as a partial match, created an immediate schism in how the evidence was interpreted by the authorities in the United Kingdom versus those in Portugal. Analysts reviewing the case have highlighted that this discrepancy was not merely scientific, but procedural. In the British legal system, a match of 15 out of 19 markers is considered extremely significant. Legal experts noted that in the United Kingdom, evidence of this strength would typically meet the threshold for probable cause, potentially justifying arrests or formal charges. The statistical likelihood of such a match belonging to an unrelated random individual is infinitesimally low, leading British investigators to view the results as a strong indication of identity. However, the Portuguese authorities operated under a different set of forensic protocols, which were far more rigid. Their standard required a full match of all 15 markers used in their system to be considered conclusive proof of identification. Because the sample yielded a result that was technically incomplete under these strict criteria, the Portuguese system categorized the evidence as inconclusive. Despite this classification, analysts were quick to point out a critical fact. The results did not exclude the missing daughter as the donor of the biological material. The failure to obtain a perfect match was due to the degradation of the sample, not a mismatch in the genetic code. This nuance was often lost in the polarized media coverage, where one side claimed the evidence was proof of guilt, while the other dismissed it as entirely irrelevant. The ambiguity allowed for the persistence of two contradictory narratives. For the investigators who believed in the theory of a fatal event within the apartment, the 15 matching markers were the smoking gun that linked the family to the scene in a way that an abduction scenario could not explain. For the defense, the lack of a 100% match was a shield, allowing them to argue that the evidence was circumstantial and potentially the result of contamination or transfer from innocent sources. This forensic standoff brought the statement, "I am being framed," into sharper focus. Statement analyst Tanya Cadogan argued that this specific phrasing was a reaction to the weight of this forensic evidence. By claiming a frame-up, the subject was not necessarily denying that the biological material belonged to the missing daughter. Instead, Cadogan interpreted the statement as an admission that the samples were indeed authentic, meaning they belonged to the daughter, but that their location was the result of a deliberate act by a third party. This interpretation suggests a complex psychological acknowledgement, the acceptance that the physical evidence was real, combined with a rejection of responsibility for how it arrived there. The complexity of the situation was further compounded by the question of transfer. If the DNA was indeed that of the missing daughter, could it have been deposited through innocent means? Forensic experts debated whether saliva from a toy, hair from clothing, or other casual contact could create a sample strong enough to generate 15 matching markers. The detection dog's specific alert to the scent of decomposition, however, added a layer of difficulty to the innocent transfer theory. While scents cannot be seen or DNA tested, the combination of a cadaver dog's alert and a subsequent high-probability DNA match in the exact same location presented a compelling circumstantial case that proved difficult for investigators to ignore. As the chapter on forensics concluded, the investigation found itself in a deadlock. The science had spoken, but it had spoken in a dialect that the two legal systems translated differently. The British saw a match. The Portuguese saw an inconclusive result. This lack of definitive, irrefutable proof meant that the inquiry could not proceed to a formal prosecution based solely on the biological findings. The silent evidence had raised more questions than it answered, deepening the mystery and leaving the true nature of the events in the apartment suspended between the probability of science and the certainty required by law. The debate over those 15 markers would continue to echo through the years, serving as a testament to the limitations of forensic science when faced with the chaotic reality of an uncontrolled crime scene. The investigative focus shifted dramatically when the inquiry expanded beyond the immediate perimeter of the Holiday apartment and turned toward the movements of the family in the weeks following the disappearance. This new phase centered on a silver vehicle, a rental car that would become one of the most contentious pieces of physical evidence in the entire case. The vehicle in question was not present on the night the daughter vanished. Records confirmed that the family did not hire this specific car until 25 days after the initial report was filed. This temporal gap created a logical paradox that continues to baffle criminologists and forensic experts. If the abduction occurred on the first night, as the primary narrative suggested, the missing daughter should never have been in contact with a vehicle obtained nearly a month later. Despite this timeline discrepancy, the specialized detection dogs deployed from the United Kingdom reacted strongly to the vehicle. The specialized detection dog alerted to the car, and forensic teams subsequently recovered biological samples from the interior. When these samples were subjected to laboratory analysis, they yielded the same complex result found in the apartment: a DNA profile containing 15 out of 19 genetic markers consistent with the missing daughter. The discovery of such specific biological material in a car rented weeks after the event presented a challenge to every established theory. For the investigators, the presence of these markers suggested that the body of the missing daughter had been in contact with the vehicle long after the initial search began, implying that she had been moved rather than immediately taken from the area. Analysts reviewing the case have dissected the implications of this finding, noting that it forced the inquiry to consider the possibility of a secondary crime scene. If the fluid found in the car was indeed from the missing daughter, it suggested that she had been concealed in an unknown location for several weeks before being transported. This theory of concealment and transport offered a grim explanation for the lack of findings during the initial sweep of the resort. However, defense experts and independent observers raised the issue of cross-contamination. They argued that the DNA could have been transferred to the car via objects that had been in contact with the daughter prior to her disappearance, such as clothing, soft toys, or the parents themselves. This transfer theory posits that the biological material was residual, carried into the vehicle by the family members who were using it, rather than direct contact with the missing subject. The most controversial counter-narrative to explain the vehicle evidence was the suggestion of a frame-up, Some observers and supporters of the family speculated that the biological material might have been planted by the police to manufacture a case against the parents when the investigation stalled. However, logistical analysts have pointed out significant flaws in this conspiracy theory. For the police to plant evidence successfully, they would have needed to know exactly which car the family intended to rent before the transaction occurred, or they would have required undetected access to the vehicle after it was in the family's possession. Procedurally, investigators would typically examine rental records to see who had accessed the car previously, making a clandestine planting operation highly risky and difficult to execute without leaving a paper trail. Furthermore, the specific nature of the dog's alerts added weight to the argument against simple transfer. The canine unit was trained to distinguish between the scent of a living person or minor traces and the specific chemical compounds associated with a major forensic event. The alert indicated the presence of the latter. Critics of the transfer theory argue that while DNA can be transferred via a teddy bear or a blanket, the specific forensic scent is not typically transferred in sufficient quantity by such items to trigger a trained dog weeks later. This distinction remains a central point of friction between the forensic interpretation and the defense's explanation. The anomaly of the vehicle evidence created a stalemate. On one side stood the abduction theory, which could not account for the daughter's presence in a car rented 25 days later. On the other side stood the theory of concealment and movement, which relied on the interpretation of partial DNA matches and dog alerts that were not considered conclusive in a Portuguese court of law. The car became a symbol of the investigation's ambiguity, a container of evidence that was simultaneously damning and explainable, depending on which narrative one chose to believe. It highlighted the limitations of forensic science when the chain of custody and the timeline of events do not align perfectly. Ultimately, the discovery in the rental car deepened the mystery, suggesting that the timeline of the disappearance might have been far more complex and prolonged than the public had been led to believe, yet lacking the definitive proof required to rewrite the official history of the case. The trajectory of the investigation underwent a seismic shift when the status of the mother changed formally from a witness to a suspect, a legal designation known in the Portuguese system as being made an arguido. This procedural change was not merely administrative. It marked the moment when the accumulated weight of the forensic anomalies, the alerts from the detection dogs, and the partial DNA matches was placed directly before the parents. During the intense questioning that followed, the investigators presented the forensic findings recovered from behind the sofa and the rental vehicle, challenging the narrative of abduction that had been maintained since the beginning. It was in this high-pressure environment that a specific statement was recorded, one that linguistic analysts and criminologists would dissect for years to come. The assertion by the mother that she was being framed. Statement analyst Tanya Cadogan has provided extensive commentary on this particular choice of words, arguing that it reveals a complex psychological state rather than a simple denial. Cadogan notes that by saying she was being framed, the mother did not claim the evidence was fake or that the laboratory results were erroneous. Instead, the analyst explains that this phrasing implies an acknowledgement that the evidence found, specifically the biological fluids, did indeed belong to the missing daughter. The implication, according to Cadogan's review, is that the mother accepted that the specific biological evidence existed, but she attributed its location to the malicious intent of an external actor. This distinction is critical because, in the view of the analyst, it serves as an admission that the daughter was in a condition that allowed such samples to be taken and later found in the apartment and vehicle. The linguistic structure of this defense has been contrasted sharply with how individuals typically react to accidental tragedies. Analysts point out that when a death is accidental, the responsible party often uses language that seeks to explain the context or justify the mistake, using phrases that indicate a loss of control or an unforeseen error. However, in this case, the language was entirely defensive, shifting the focus outward toward a conspiracy rather than inward toward an explanation of events. Cadogan observed that the statement "I am being framed" fits a pattern of resistance, where the speaker distances themselves from the act, while recognizing the physical reality of the proof. The analyst concluded that this choice of words aligned more closely with a denial of accusation than with the clarification of a mishap, suggesting a mindset focused on self-preservation against a perceived external threat. This theory of framing also introduced significant logistical paradoxes that the investigation struggled to reconcile. The analyst questioned when the samples necessary for such a frame-up could have been obtained, and by whom. If the biological material was genuine, as the framing defense implied, it would have had to be collected either shortly after the disappearance or at some stage before the canine search teams arrived. The timeline presented a practical impossibility for the framing narrative, particularly regarding the vehicle evidence. Analysts asked how investigators or unknown conspirators could have planted traces in a car that the family would not hire until 25 days after the initial report. The suggestion that police or third parties held onto evidence to plant it weeks later appeared difficult to reconcile with the urgent nature of the initial search. Furthermore, the psychological implications of this statement extended to the relationship between the parents and the authorities. Reports surfaced that even within the wider family circle, there was an anticipation that formal charges might be brought, specifically against the mother. The analyst described a scenario where the distribution of evidence seemed to implicate her more heavily than anyone else, noting that traces were reportedly found on items associated with her and the missing daughter, such as clothing and a soft toy, while nothing was linked directly to the father. This fueled speculation that if the framing theory were true, it was designed with a specific target in mind. However, the analyst also noted that if the Portuguese police truly possessed remains or definitive proof of death to frame the suspect, they would likely have announced the discovery to resolve the case immediately, rather than letting it drag on for years at great expense. The statement also brought to light the internal conflict between the parents' public confidence and private uncertainty. While publicly stating that the DNA results would show they were completely innocent, the acknowledgement of a frame-up suggested a fear that the evidence was damning enough to require a conspiracy defense. Cadogan interprets this as a turning point, where the defensive narrative had to account for physical realities that could no longer be dismissed as mere absence. The claim of being framed effectively placed the mother in a position where she validated the existence of the forensic links, while simultaneously declaring that a complex plot was responsible for them, a stance that required the public to believe in a sophisticated conspiracy involving law enforcement, forensic labs, and unknown actors working in concert to incriminate her. Ultimately, the phrase, "I am being framed," became the defining linguistic marker of this phase of the investigation. It moved the discourse away from the possibility of a wandering stranger and anchored it firmly in the realm of forensic dispute and legal maneuvering. To the analysts, it was a statement that revealed more than it concealed, suggesting that the speaker knew the evidence was real and that the battle would not be about whether the biological material existed, but about how it came to be located behind a sofa and in the trunk of a rental car. It transformed the case from a search for a missing person into a battle over the interpretation of silent, microscopic testimony, leaving the audience to decide whether they were witnessing a desperate truth or a calculated defense. The investigation into the disappearance took a cerebral turn as experts began to look beyond the physical evidence and scrutinize the verbal behavior of the parents. While forensic teams analyzed biological samples, a different group of specialist forensic linguists and statement analysts turned their attention to the thousands of words spoken in interviews and police interrogations. This phase of the inquiry operated on the principle that the subconscious mind often reveals what the conscious mind attempts to conceal, specifically through the selection of pronouns, verb tenses, and sentence structures. The analysis of the parents' language provided a psychological roadmap that diverged significantly from the standard public narrative of a grieving family seeking the return of a missing daughter. A primary focus of this linguistic dissection was the calculated shift in pronoun usage. Analysts observed a distinct pattern in how the parents referred to themselves and the events surrounding the disappearance. When discussing the timeline of the evening or the actions taken by the group, the language was heavily pluralized. The frequent use of the pronoun we was interpreted by experts as an attempt to distribute emotional and procedural responsibility. By anchoring their actions in a collective identity we checked, we decided we were certain the parents effectively shared the burden of the events, creating a psychological barrier against individual culpability. This safety in numbers approach is a common feature in statement analysis when a group is maintaining a unified front, offering collective justification for decisions that later come under scrutiny. However, a critical divergence occurred when the topic shifted to blame, criticism, or direct accusation. In these moments, the mother's language frequently reverted to the singular I or me. Statement analyst Tanya Cadogan noted that this shift creates a separation between the shared defense of the group and the personal isolation of the suspect. When the pressure of the investigation intensified, particularly regarding the forensic findings, the we dissolved, leaving the individual to defend against the specific implications of the evidence. This linguistic oscillation suggested that while the couple appeared aligned in maintaining a public image of unity, there was a private, internal division regarding the emotional weight of the investigation. Furthermore, the analysis highlighted a significant absence of what experts term accident indicators in the parents' statements. In typical cases where a tragedy occurs due to negligence or an unforeseen mishap, the responsible party often uses language that conveys a loss of control or a desire to explain the mechanics of the error. Phrases such as, "It happened so quickly, it was a mistake," or "I didn't mean to," are commonplace in genuine accident narratives. These markers serve to contextualize the event and express remorse. In this case, however, such modifiers were entirely absent. The language used did not attempt to reconstruct a tragic sequence of events, but instead focused on establishing a rigid boundary between the family and the disappearance. Cadogan's review emphasized that the parents' phrasing fell consistently into a defensive category rather than an explanatory one. When individuals are truthful about an accident, their pronouns tend to remain personal and active, such as "I dropped" or "I forgot." In contrast, the statements recorded in this investigation utilized distancing language and passive structures, such as "it was done," or referring to the event as an external phenomenon. This passive voice removes the speaker from the timeline of causality, effectively erasing their agency in the outcome. By focusing on being targeted, questioned, and misrepresented, the narrative became one of confrontation with the authorities rather than a confession of an internal failure. This linguistic distancing was also evident in the way questions were answered during interviews. Analysts noted a recurring behavioral marker, where the mother would redirect inquiries about the specific events of the night toward discussions about police conduct and media perception. This technique of avoidance is significant. It indicates that the priority of the speaker is to contest the motive of the accuser, rather than to clarify the sequence of the disappearance. While avoidance is not legal proof of guilt, in the realm of statement analysis, it serves to classify the nature of the statement. The consistent redirection away from the what happened and toward the how we are being treated suggested a mindset focused on reputational management and legal defense. The broader implications of this analysis painted a complex picture of the psychological state within the family. The absence of remorseful language and the heavy reliance on external attribution blaming a kidnapper or a police conspirator enforced the conclusion that the parents were operating under a framework of self-preservation. The analyst Cadogan summarized that while the public saw a campaign for a missing daughter, the linguistic evidence revealed a different story, a narrative of defense against implied culpability. The wording demonstrated a belief that survival depended on maintaining a strict distinction between their actions and the outcome, a belief that external forces controlled the narrative and that personal admission was dangerous. Ultimately, the linguistic evidence provided a shadow narrative to the forensic one, just as the DNA results were inconclusive but indicative. The language was defensive but not explicitly confessory. The analysis concluded that wording alone could not establish the cause of death or the reality of the event. However, it demonstrated that the mother's perception of her reality was shaped by the need to defend against an accusation she felt was inevitable. The phrase, "I am being framed," was the pinnacle of this defensive architecture, revealing a state of mind that accepted the presence of physical proof while rejecting the moral and legal responsibility for it. In the silence where a confession might have been expected, there was instead a carefully constructed wall of words, built to withstand the pressure of an investigation that could find no cracks in the story, even as the science suggested they might exist. The investigation's most unsettling alternative to the abduction theory centered on the hypothesis of a concealed accident. This line of inquiry, pursued quietly by the investigators, posited that the events of that evening were not the result of a predatory intrusion, but rather an unforeseen internal tragedy that spiraled into a cover-up. Analysts reviewing this theory suggested that if the death had been accidental, the subsequent actions of the parents might have been driven by an overwhelming panic and a fear of exposure rather than a deliberate, premeditated intent to deceive. The core of this hypothesis rested on the idea that an immediate admission of an accident would have triggered a forensic autopsy, a procedure that could potentially reveal medical findings inconsistent with standard parental care. The speculation among observers focused on the potential use of sedation or medication to aid sleep, which, if discovered in a toxicology report, could have led to devastating professional and social consequences. Both parents were respected medical professionals, and the discovery of any irregularity in their care duties could have resulted in the revocation of their medical licenses and the termination of their careers. Furthermore, analysts noted that the fear extended beyond professional ruin. There was a genuine terror regarding the custody of the remaining siblings. In this context, the concealment was not necessarily an act of malice, but a desperate, high-stakes attempt to preserve the family unit and prevent the surviving children from being taken into state care. This perspective reframed the narrative from a crime of violence to a crime of preservation. The analyst Tanya K. Dogan suggested that the couple faced a profound conflict between moral truth and self-preservation, where the need to protect their reputation and stability outweighed the obligation of openness. The theory proposed that the continued maintenance of the abduction story was a rationalized mechanism to spare the family from social condemnation, legal jeopardy, and total emotional collapse. Under this framework, the frantic timeline and the inconsistencies in statements were not signs of a sophisticated criminal plot, but rather the fractured, panic-stricken responses of individuals trying to control an irreversible loss. As the investigation dragged on, the relationship between the family and the Portuguese authorities deteriorated into a state of open diplomatic and procedural conflict. The tone of communication shifted from mutual cooperation to deep suspicion, creating an atmosphere of tension that shaped the entire course of the inquiry. This friction was encapsulated in a reported statement attributed to the mother. "Police do not want a murder in Portugal." Analysts treated this remark as highly significant because it implied that the mother believed the authorities were aware of evidence pointing to a death, but were politically motivated to ignore it. This statement highlighted the immense pressure on the Portuguese investigators, who were operating under the scrutiny of the international media and the weight of their own national tourism industry. To some observers, the police's hesitation to issue definitive conclusions was interpreted as a reluctance to acknowledge a homicide on national soil, which could have damaging economic repercussions. Conversely, the authorities viewed the family's aggressive media campaign not as a search for truth, but as a strategy to manipulate public perception and influence the direction of the case. The divergence in approach created a stalemate. The investigators were restricted by the judicial secrecy laws of Portugal, requiring discretion and silence. The parents, demanding resolution and vindication, utilized open communication channels to challenge the police narrative. The phrase regarding the police not wanting a murder became a symbol of this breakdown in trust. It suggested a scenario where the investigation was no longer about finding a missing person, but about a political standoff between a family demanding exoneration and a police force paralyzed by the implications of their own forensic findings. The theory that the parents were victims of a police frame-up, while emotionally compelling to their supporters, faced significant logistical hurdles when scrutinized against the timeline. The central contradiction lay in the vehicle evidence. The forensic alerts and the recovery of biological samples occurred in a car that the family did not hire until 25 days after the disappearance was reported. For the framing theory to hold, investigators or a third party would have needed to plant biological material in a vehicle that had not yet been rented at the time the initial samples were allegedly secured. Analysts asked a practical question. If the samples had been gathered early in the investigation, how would anyone have known to plant them in that specific vehicle weeks later? The logistics of such an operation would require undetected access to the car and a guarantee that the transfer of material would not be witnessed. Furthermore, investigators would typically examine who had rented the car previously, meaning any attempt to plant evidence would leave a trail of accountability. No explanation was ever offered by the defense as to how such a transfer could occur without attracting immediate attention or leaving a record. Another major inconsistency in the framing narrative was the absence of the ultimate proof: the missing individual. Analysts reasoned that if the Portuguese police truly possessed the remains of the missing daughter and intended to frame the parents, they would have announced the discovery to solve the case immediately. A discovery of the body would have allowed for swift charges of concealment or homicide, ending the investigation and the media circus. Instead, the police never confirmed the discovery of remains. The idea that authorities would find the victim, conceal the discovery, and then plant microscopic evidence to create a confusing partial match defied procedural logic. The lack of a definitive forensic conclusion suggested that the police were following leads rather than manufacturing them, leaving the framing theory as a psychological defense rather than a factual reality. Throughout the ordeal, the behavior of the group known as the Tapper Seven and the family dynamics provided a rich field for psychological analysis. The group maintained a disciplined silence, a behavior that some interpreted as loyalty and others as a collective effort to contain a shared secret. Within the family unit, analysts observed different coping mechanisms. The father was described as pragmatic and focused on containment, rationalizing the maintenance of the abduction narrative as a necessary act of protection for the twins. This approach was viewed as an attempt to prevent further psychological harm to the mother and the remaining children. In contrast, the mother's public demeanor often revealed signs of immense emotional strain. Reports noted physical signs of distress, such as bruising on her wrists and arms, which some analysts interpreted as indicators of family tension or frustration. Though no confirmed evidence linked these marks to a specific event, the continued public appeals and the creation of a fund were seen by some as a way to preserve an appearance of hope and purpose, a coping mechanism to sustain meaning under the crushing pressure of the investigation. The linguistic patterns analyzed in previous chapters also reflected this psychological state. The shift from we to I when discussing blame indicated a private isolation masked by public unity. The analyst K. Doggan observed that while the couple appeared aligned, their internal experiences were likely divided, with the father focused on the practical management of the crisis and the mother grappling with the emotional weight of the accusations. This dynamic suggested that their actions were not evidence of calculated malice, but of a family operating in survival mode, trying to maintain coherence amid a total collapse of their normal lives. As the months turned into years, the case fragmented into two disconnected narratives that ran parallel, but never intersected. On one side was the abduction narrative, supported by the initial witness statements, the open window, and the sketches of potential suspects. This story relied on the idea of a stranger intervening in the family's life, a predator who vanished into the night. It was a narrative of external danger that resonated with parents worldwide, driving the media coverage and the fundraising efforts. On the other side was the internal event narrative, supported by the forensic alerts from the detection dogs and the partial DNA matches found in the apartment and the rental car. This narrative suggested a closed circle of events where the answer lay within the family unit and their immediate surroundings. The two stories could not coexist. If the dogs were right, the abduction theory was flawed. If the abduction was real, the forensic evidence was a misleading anomaly. The public and the investigators were left to choose between these two realities. The procedural posture of the case intensified the confusion. As the investigation continued to be classified as an abduction in the absence of a body, yet the questions asked of the parents clearly pointed toward suspicion of involvement in a death. This duality meant that the case was never fully treated as a homicide nor fully cleared as a missing person inquiry. The disconnect between the physical alerts and the lack of a body created a vacuum where speculation flourished, and the truth became a matter of interpretation rather than fact. The investigation into the disappearance of the daughter eventually became one of the most expensive and prolonged inquiries in history, yet it yielded no legal resolution. Millions of pounds and euros were spent on extended searches, private investigators, and police operations, all continuing to pursue the theory of a living child or a trafficking network. Despite the massive expenditure of resources, the central questions remained unanswered. The forensic results, while indicative, never met the standard required for a conviction in court, leaving the 15 out of 19 markers as a statistical footnote rather than a legal verdict. The case files were opened, closed, and archived, only to be reopened again as new suspects emerged and faded. The lack of a definitive forensic conclusion left every interpretation open to challenge. Some viewed the lack of charges as proof of innocence, while others saw it as a failure of procedure and analysis. The only certainty was that the physical evidence, rather than clarifying the events, had deepened the mystery. The political and social cost was also high. The case changed the way missing person investigations were handled and highlighted the difficulties of cross-border cooperation. However, for the family and the public, the lack of an ending was the defining feature. The framed defense was never tested in court, and the abduction theory was never proven by a rescue. The case remained an unfinished puzzle, a collection of piece dogs, DNA, timelines, and statements that refused to fit together into a single, coherent picture. In the final analysis, the mystery of Praia da Luz is a story of human contradiction as much as it is a forensic riddle. The case reflects the tension between grief and denial, between the responsibility of guardianship and the instinct for self-preservation. The statement, "I am being framed," stands as the most revealing sentence of the entire saga, a linguistic bridge that connects the physical evidence of death with the psychological defense of innocence. It revealed a state of mind that believed external forces controlled the narrative and that survival depended on maintaining a rigid distinction between the self and the event. The evidence linked to the missing daughter was found in two distinct places: the apartment and the car, yet the time, method, and continuity of these discoveries were never resolved. The dogs alerted, the DNA spoke in probabilities, and the timeline defied logic. Together, they formed a body of evidence that changed the direction of the investigation, but never settled what it truly meant. As we look back on the events that began on that spring evening in 2007, we are left with a profound sense of ambiguity. The search for the truth was obscured by the noise of the media, the clash of legal systems, and the complex psychology of a family under siege. The silent evidence remains, waiting for the final piece of the puzzle that may never be found. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into one of the most complex cases of our time. If you found this detailed breakdown of the evidence and the linguistic analysis insightful, please consider supporting the channel. Click the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you do not miss our future investigations into the world's most mysterious cases. We want to hear your perspective. Leave a comment below and tell us what you think about the framed statement and the forensic findings. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning the narrative.